This is the Lotus Bloom Podcast. And here is your host, Morgan Wylie.
Welcome back to another episode of the Lotus Bloom Podcast. I'm your host, Morgan Wylie, and this is my segment I'm calling It's Time to Write. In these episodes, I'm sharing my writing process with you as I dive into Book 5 in the Age of Elandria series, my young adult fantasy. I hope to offer some insight into my process and some tips and tricks I've learned along the way, and I might even invite a guest or two to join me. So for now, it's time to write. In this episode, I've invited an author friend of mine, Rose Garcia, to share with you her outlining process. I've had the pleasure of working with Rose through the Havenwood Falls universe, and I'm excited for her to share with you today. Take it away, Rose.
Hey guys, this is Rose Garcia coming to you live from Houston, Texas, in quarantine. Well, I'm not in quarantine. I'm in self-isolation. I just want to tell you that I have dogs here, so if you hear them barking or shuffling, that's my coworkers, and they are sometimes a little bit antsy. But anyway, yeah, so I'm Rose Garcia. I am a young adult author, and I write upper YA. My series that I'm known for is the Final Life series, and it's an urban fantasy, and I also have some books written in the Havenwood Falls universe, my Saving Infinity duology. It's in the young adult line. And then also I have a story in the anthology, Sun and Moon Academy anthology. I have a story in the fall semester and a story in the spring semester, which is coming out in hopefully the next few months. The very awesome Morgan asked me to come on her podcast and talk a little bit about how I outline. When I first started writing, I didn't outline. I just kind of was a pantser. I just kind of did everything by the seat of my pants and stream of consciousness. And I just kind of let my story in my head just flow down into my fingers and onto my laptop and onto the pages. And I did that. And I thought my book was amazing. And then I showed it to a writing coach, and she basically told me to start over. So I had a lot of good stuff come out of that first draft, and I learned a lot about myself as a writer. I guess one of the big things that I learned was what not to do. And for me, being 100% of a pantser was something that I needed to not do. And I kind of didn't know where to go with my thoughts and everything I had written and everything that was going on in my book. And so I went to this class, and, I'm from Houston, Texas, and we have a really amazing writing community. So I went to this class, and the speaker that day was talking about outlining. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is exactly what I need. And she showed me an approach, and it's an approach that I now use with my writing. It's hard for me to explain like this on a podcast, but I want you, if you can, to get out a sheet of paper or visualize this, and you want to draw a grid. And it will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. So you'll have these squares, and each square represents a chapter. So on the first line, I have a square that says chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. And then on the second line, I have my squares that are chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. And then the next line, I have another 5 chapters, and then the last line, another 5 chapters. So this is kind of a grid to help you with a 20 chapter book. And it can be, of course, shorter or longer depending on what you're writing. So I have my grids, I have my squares. And for chapter 1, I also have written in my square that this is the opening, this is the world as it is, and then the chapter ends with the main character's world in a sudden change. And then at each 5th chapter, so at chapter 5, chapter 10, chapter 15, there's something that happens in the story that's a major turning point, and there's no going back. So a turning point is where the hero or the heroine makes a decision or does something that he or she can't change or turn back from. So you have a turning point in chapter 5, 10, and 15. And then based on a 20 chapter book, at chapter 18, you have the climax / the black moment. And then in chapter 20, you have the resolution. Either the happily ever after or the happily for now, depending on what you're writing. So looking at your grid and starting, with your outlining process, you are basically going to write 1 or 2 sentences in each square about what is happening in that chapter. Mind you, this is just like a skeleton. For chapter 1, you might say, scene 1, Infinity gets on a plane and the plane almost crashes and they have to do an emergency landing. Okay, scene 1. Scene 2, she ends up in a town close to Havenwood Falls and almost has a car accident and actually ends up in Havenwood Falls. So that's scene 1, scene 2. And then in chapter 2, same thing, scene 1, scene 2. Well, what do you want to happen in this chapter? And if you're following this character, Infinity, and I'm using Infinity because she's the character in my Havenwood Falls book. If we're using the same character, then you'll have in chapter 2, scene 1, scene 2, and you will progress the story with each chapter. Or you can have a different character if you're alternating POVs or whatever it is you're doing. Basically, it's kind of like giving yourself a roadmap. You have your chapters, you have your squares, you have scene 1, scene 2, what you want to happen in each chapter. And you also need to keep in mind those major turning points and, of course, the climax, the black moment, and the resolution in those last 3 chapters. But it's something that I found useful to help me get my story progressing and moving and get it succinct and to help my characters grow and develop. And this was just my roadmap. Now, I had with one of my books where I did this grid, and it kind of turned out the same way. Like when I actually sat down and put, my fingers on the keyboard, it actually kind of turned out that my initial outline was really the outline of the book. But then I've also have had other books where I've done my initial outline of what I want to happen in each chapter, scene 1, scene 2. And then as I'm writing it, my characters don't want to do what I thought they wanted to do. And so I might have to go back and start over with my grid each time that I find that my characters are wanting to do other things. And that's fine too, because a lot of times your characters will take on a life of their own and opinions, and they will, instead of taking, a risk and getting in a car and driving around Colorado and almost having a car accident, maybe they're going to do something else. Maybe the character is going to go hiking and end up in Havenwood Falls. Or maybe the character is going to meet someone who's ventured out of Havenwood Falls and brings them back. I mean, you just don't know what your characters are going to do until you really become the character and really breathe life into the character. I'm digressing. So for the outline, I really love this grid because it helps me to stay on track. It gives me a guide for where I want to go, but it also gives me a whole lot of freedom to change what I'm doing. So I haven't spent a whole ton of time doing an outline. And I know that there are some authors out there that will actually write an outline that's almost the size of a novella. You know, it's like a 20,000 word outline. That's awesome. For me, I just needed the quick wham bam. This is what's going to happen in this chapter. This is what's going to happen in this chapter. This is what's going to happen in this chapter. And then as you progress and you're following your grid, it kind of will help you stay on track. That's what I have. And I wonder if I should take a picture of this and do like a blog post on it, because it's really some good stuff. It's really helped me with my productivity and has really helped me stay on track with my writing. Even if I follow the grid, if I don't follow it, it still keeps me accountable and on course. But if you want to find me online, you can go to my website, rosegarciabooks.com. And on the menu, you will see my blog. You can click on there and you can read stuff about me. And I do try to include writing tips regularly. And looking at this sheet of paper in front of my face with these empty grids, I'm thinking this would be a really good thing to blog about right now, because people are home and people are writing and reading and doing things. But hopefully if you're a writer, you're doing some writing. But I hope that made sense. I hope you got a visual for this grid that I'm referring to. I will do a blog post. I absolutely will. I'll make that a priority this week. That's it. Happy writing.
Thank you so much, Rose, for sharing your outlining process with us. To find Rose's books, you can go to Amazon and look up Rose Garcia. You can also find her on her website at rosegarciabooks.com and on Instagram at rosegarciabooks. I'd encourage you to check her out. Thanks so much, and for now, it's time to write.